So this is joint work with Gustavo, Alejandro, and Chris. Okay, so we're going to talk about household debt of this paper. All right, so let me first show you this picture to motivate this paper a little bit. Okay, so what this paper shows is the trend in the total debt balance in the U.S. households over the past decade. Okay, so we see that it has been increasing substantially. Now, more specifically, the total debt amount increased from just a little bit over $6 trillion in early 2000, all the way to almost triple that number to over $16 trillion in recent years. Okay, so now given this trend, several recent studies, including empirical studies and theoretical studies, have been showing that there is the household debt overhang problem. Okay? Now, in people's labor market decision. Okay, so what is the intuition? The intuition is actually very straightforward. This is because in the U.S. market, in the U.S. bankruptcy, most of the households are protected by limited liabilities. So in a bankruptcy, they can discharge most of the loans. Okay? Now, if I know that my debt will eventually be wiped out, I don't want to work anymore. And instead, I just want to enjoy life and wait for the discharge of my debt later. Okay? Now, more formally, that intuition can be summarized as follows. Okay? Any incremental income from labor supply will be used to fulfill the debt obligations before default. Okay, so that postpones the discharge of my debt in the bankruptcy later, and that benefits the creditors. Okay? In other words, in this case, the household is paying all the cost of supplying labor, but return of the labor supply will have to be shared with some of the lenders. And such a wealth transfer from the households to the creditors will discourage the households to work ex ante. Okay, so that's basically the intuition of the debt overhang problem. All right, but a less well understood problem is an equally important aspect of the household decision. That is the human capital investment. And this is different from labor supply because human capital is inalienable from the households. Okay? In other words, the knowledge or skills that I learned, okay, cannot be completely transferred to the creditors and cannot be completely taken away by the creditors. As long as I can continue to use the learned skills and knowledges, those skills will still generate incremental income even after default. Okay. In this case, the household gets to keep most of the returns from the human capital investment instead of being taken away by creditors. Now, put it differently, this feature of insolvability will mitigate the wealth transfer from households to creditors that we have been talking about for labor supply, and that will make the human capital investment more resilient to the debt overhang problem. Okay? Now, on the other hand, despite this difference between these two actions are also connected with each other. Okay? This is because learned skills will only be valuable if the households anticipate that they will supply labor in the future. And if I know that eventually I will stop working completely, there's no point for me to learn skills to increase my productivity today, because eventually my skills will become useless at the point when I stop working. Okay? So in this paper, what we're going to do is to integrate these two aspects, and we're going to build a dynamic model to first examine how these two actions are differently affected by household leverage, and then we're going to look at how these two actions are also connected with each other. Okay? Now, and then after that, we will do some empirical analysis, and then we will find empirical support for the model predictions. And for the rest of the paper, we're going to focus on one specific type of human capital investment, that is skills acquisition after the individual starts in a career. Okay? And as we will explain later, this is because we have good data and good identification for this type of human capital investment. And lastly, we believe that these questions are relevant given the recent shortage in labor skills, especially in the US market. and also several recent econ papers documenting the importance of mitigating human capital depreciation, as I listed over here. Okay? All right, so let's first dive into the model. So what I'm going to do today is that I will try to explain the model in the most intuitive way, and I will leave the math and solutions to the paper for the details. Okay. All right. So we're going to look at a risk-averse household. Okay. And this household derives utility from consumption C, and this utility from either supplying labor L or putting effort A to acquire human capital. Okay? So now we see that in the second equation here, that is the cost function. Okay? So there are two thetas in the first two terms. And these two thetas denotes the separate cost of providing labor or acquiring human capital. Okay? And there's a third theta that is in the last term over here, theta AL. So that captures the correlation between the costs of these two actions. And later on, I will elaborate on this parameter, and we will derive different model predictions based on that parameter. So we will come back to that. Okay. All right. So the household will maximize the lifetime utility by solving this equation 3, subject to two dynamics. Okay. The first dynamic is the hourly wage K. Okay. The hourly wage K is determined by the productivity of a person, which in turn is determined by the human capital. That is why you see that parameter A, the first parameter in the brackets, parameter A, that is the effort in human capital investment, that will increase the hourly wage by increasing the productivity. However, the skills will depreciate over time when the skills become obsolete. That depreciation rate is captured by the second parameter rho in this brackets here. And later on, we will do some comparative statics on this parameter rho, and it turns out that this is an important parameter that helps reveal the economic intuition of our model. So again, we will come back to that parameter. And the last term in the brackets just captures the income uncertainty, which is the standard ground motion. And the sigma is the captures the uncertainty. Okay, so that's equation 4. So equation 5 and 6 are essentially the law of motion for savings parameter S. Okay, so there are two situations to consider savings. One is before default, and one is after. And before default is equation 5, and after default is equation 6. Okay, so here's the intuition. Okay. Before the household defaults, the household has access to the credit market, so it can either borrow or save. Okay? The S parameter can be either positive or negative. A positive value means deposit, savings, and a negative value means borrowing, because negative saving is essentially borrowing. Okay? So now we see that before defaults, the person can save into a bank account, for example, at the interest rate of R, and consumption, the second term C over here, decreases the deposit. But earnings, the last term, increases the savings. Okay? So notice that the last term, earnings, is the product of two parameters, K, which is the hourly wage, and L, which is the labor supply, essentially the number of work hours. So the product of these two gives us the total wage. Okay? All right, so after default is equation 6. So after default, as I just said, the person files bankruptcy, and in chapter 7, the person can discharge the debt, reduces the amount of debt to 0. Okay? Now, because of the discharge, the person is also the person's credit worthiness is also damaged, so he's shunned from accessing the credit market anymore, in which case he will be forced to have 0 debt and 0 savings. Okay? So this is just a baseline assumption for the benchmark case, and in the extension of the model, we relax that condition a little bit, and then we allow the person to continue to partially access the credit market even after default, so he can continue to save or borrow, and that does not change the main takeaway of the model. Okay. All right, so now with everything in place, we can solve this model And here's the value function. I'm not going to talk about the details of all the components of the value function, but at the end of the day, we can show that this value function can be characterized by one single state variable, which is the big letter L, which is essentially proportional to the parameter S, savings, or equivalently proportional to borrowing, because borrowing is negative saving. So that is why we interpret the state variable L as the normalized proxy for household leverage, and we will derive the optimal policy for both human capital investment and labor supply as a function of this state variable, household leverage. Okay, and this picture shows you the optimal policy here for these two actions. Okay. So for today's presentation, if I can direct your attention to these two solid lines. Okay. Now let's start with panel B on the right. Okay. So we see that the labor supply shows a hump shape with respect to household leverage, which is normalized to between 0 and 100% on the x-axis. And let me first explain the intuition. Why do we see this hump shape? This hump shape arises because of the interplay of two forces. The first force is very straightforward. It's a standard marginal utility argument. That is, as the leverage initially increases, when the leverage is still relatively low, that means that the household has to pay a bigger proportion of his income into paying off the debt. And that decreases the consumption level of the household and therefore increases the marginal utility of any additional consumption. And that increased marginal utility will promote the household to work harder in order to get higher earnings and to achieve a higher level of consumption. So that's why we see that, first of all, there's an increasing trend of the labor supply. But then as the leverage surpasses a certain level, as bankruptcy becomes more likely, the debt overhang problem kicks in. Knowing that eventually my debt will be wiped out in the bankruptcy, I don't want to work anymore. Okay? So that's why we see that the labor supply begins to decrease, and as you see, as the leverage further increases, that debt overhang problem is aggravated. Okay? So now if we move our attention to the left side of the picture to look at panel A, we see that skills acquisition, human capital investment, also shows a hump shape, reflecting the interplay of these two forces, but there are several important differences. The first difference is that the debt overhang problem for skills acquisition does not kick in until a later point, until a higher level of leverage compared to the case of labor supply. And then from the picture, we see that for skills acquisition, the debt overhang problem kicks in around 50% of the normalized leverage of labor supply that kicks in as early as about 40%. Okay? So in other words, we say that for labor supply, there is an earlier manifestation of debt overhang. And second difference is that once the debt overhang problem kicks in, we see that we see that the labor supply drops in a sharper manner, drops more aggressively compared to the case of skills acquisition. Okay? And this is what we call a sharper manifestation of debt overhang for labor supply. And again, why do we see these two patterns? This is because the inseparability feature of human capital, and because the households gets to keep most of the returns from human capital investment instead of being taken away by creditors, human capital skills acquisition is more resilient to debt. That's why we see these two patterns, okay? These two differences. And later on in the empirical data, we will find support to match both of these two patterns. Okay? So now if we go back to this first picture here, if we go back to panel A, we see that we see that skills acquisition mitigates the debt overhang problem for the contribution that we just said, but it does not completely eliminate it. Why is that the case? Why is there no complete elimination? Now think about this one. Okay? So skills acquisition increases the productivity and therefore help the households generate additional income, additional earnings. Okay? The value of the skills acquisition is reflected in these additional earnings. However, once the value of the skill acquisition gets materialized, gets converted into earnings, that part of earnings will become separable again from the individuals. And that part of separable earnings will again, be able to take more away by creditors. So that part of the value of the skill acquisition is the one that's continuing generating the debt-upon problem as we see over here. Okay? So now based on that intuition, you can probably imagine that the timing when the skills value gets materialized, it gets converted into earning matters. Okay? So that timing, that intuition for the timing is captured by the parameter depreciation rate of skills growth. Okay? So if a skill has a higher depreciation rate, that means that most of the skills benefits will be realized, will be materialized at an early stage. So the benefits is more front-loaded. Think about this way. Think about the extreme case when rho is extremely high. What that means is that all of the skills value will be materialized right away, right after I finish the training, right after I finish learning the skills, leaving nothing else for me tomorrow. Okay? In that case, because all of the skills value has already been converted into earnings right away immediately, all of the value now is separable, as the earnings is separable from the individuals, and it can still be taken away by the creditors later. Okay? So in that case, it is as if the skills have lost the inseparability feature, and it is as if the skills are just behaving like labor supply, which only generates short-term earnings, but nothing else in the long term. Okay? In that case, you can imagine that type of skills with high depreciation. Depreciation should be more subject to the debt-upon problem. And this is indeed what we see by solving the model. If we look at the right panel, panel B over here, that plots two cases when the depreciation of the skills is high, that's the orange line, versus the benchmark case when the depreciation is low. And we see that for the high depreciation case, there's a sharper manifestation of debt overhang in the sense that the drop of the orange line is much more aggressive than the benchline, than the baseline case. And again, later on, we will use empirical data to match this pattern as predicted. Okay? Okay? So now, so far, we have been talking about the differences between these two actions due to the inseparability feature. As I said earlier, these two actions are also connected with each other. And this connection is captured by this parameter theta AL here. Okay, so recall, what is theta AL? Theta AL is the correlation between the cost of these two actions. Okay, let's consider the case when theta AL is positive. When it is positive, that means that supplying labor will make learning skills even more costly. Okay? This happens, for example, if I only have limited time a day and I can only afford to choose one of them, but not both of them. Okay? In such a case, these two actions are substitutes. And the first result that we show when these two actions are substitutes is that as I get closer and closer to default, I will optimally choose to take more skills acquisition and give up on labor supply. Again, this is because human capital skills acquisition has a higher preserved value because of the inseparability feature. So I want to choose that one and then give up the one that has a lower value, labor supply. And that choice is reflected by the top two panels of the picture, panels A and B. In these two panels, the orange line shows you the case when these two actions are substitutes with each other. I can only choose one of them, but not both. The black line is the baseline case where these two actions are not substitutes. Okay? We first see, if we look at panel B first, we first see that as the leverage goes higher, as defaults becomes more likely, labor supply collapses very quickly compared to the black line, compared to the benchmark case. But such a collapsing is not shown on the left side. It's not shown in panel A when we look at labor skills acquisition. So what this means is that indeed people are preferring to choose skills acquisition over labor supply when they are close to default. But what's more interesting is that if we look at panel A, if we look at the level of these two lines, we see that the orange line, even before the default is more likely, at the relatively early stage, the orange line lies below the benchmark case, the black line, meaning that the skills acquisition level is much lower than the baseline case. Why is that? Happening? This is because, as we said earlier, skills is only valuable when the household anticipates to supply labor in the future. And in this case, if the household knows that later on their labor supply will collapse a lot, they will stop working very quickly, there's no point for them to learn skills ex ante. Okay? And that is why we see that the orange line lies below the black line, even when leverage is at a relatively lower level. Okay? And this is what we call a back propagation effect, as shown in the last point of the slide. The back propagation effect is how even the human capital investment is inalienable, is different from labor supply. It can still be affected by debt overhang through the effect of labor supply. Okay? All right. So we believe that this back propagation effect has important policy implications. This is because several existing studies, they are suggesting that the government can help households reduce their debt, and that has the benefit of encouraging the households to supply more labor. But on top of that, here what we're showing that in addition to that benefit on labor supply per se, ex ante, knowing that households will work more, they will be more encouraged to learn skills and therefore increase their productivity to begin with. Okay, so that is an additional benefit that's sort of at the intensive margin instead of an expensive margin about labor supply. Okay. All right. So next, we're going to take these model predictions to data, and we're going to use this NLSY survey data to test the model. And this survey covers a representative sample of Americans and tracks their lifetime activities for the next 30, 40 years. Okay, and there are three sets of information that are particularly important for our paper. Let me explain these sets of information one by one. The first one is that we can observe individuals' participation in the training program after they start their career, which is a well-defined skills acquisition of human capital investment. Okay, so more importantly, we observe that whether the training program is voluntary or required by the employers, so that we can isolate the model skills acquisition incentives. Okay? And we also observe who is paying for these programs. And we only focus on the training programs not paid by the individual themselves, but instead are paid by third parties such as the government or the employers. And this is very helpful because household leverage is correlated with financial constraints. A high household leverage means that the training program is probably less affordable. So by looking at the ones that are not paid by the individuals themselves, we can again isolate the skills acquisition incentives from affordability of the training program. Okay. All right. In addition, we observe itemized household balance sheet, including the different items in the total debt and total asset, so we can calculate household leverage as debt divided by asset. Okay. Lastly, we also observe the week-by-week records of individuals' labor force status, so we can measure the number of working hours as a proxy for their labor supply. Okay. All right. So this picture, the graphic analysis, is the baseline result for our empirical analysis. And what these two pictures show is the probability of training and the number of working hours labor supply as a function of household leverage in percentage put into different quantiles. For example, if we look at the third column in this picture, the number 32 to 49 here means that in the third quintile, the average household leverage ranges from 32 to 49%. Okay? So there are several observations that are consistent with the model prediction. First, both actions are showing this hung shape. Okay? Second, the data problem does not kick in until a later point, until a higher level of leverage for trading, for skills acquisition, compared to the case of labor supply. Okay? This is what we predicted in the model as an earlier manifestation of data warehouse for labor supply. Okay? Third, after the data problem kicks in, the job in the labor supply is much sharper. Okay? We can see that from the right side of the picture, we can see that by the last column, the top quintile of the leverage, the job of the labor supply from the peak is almost 50% of the previous one. Okay? We don't see such an aggressive job for skills acquisition for trading. Again, this matches the prediction of a sharper manifestation of data predicted by the model for labor supply. Okay? All right, so of course we can convert this graphical analysis into regression analysis. And I apologize for the small numbers, because we do have a lot of controls at the individual level, and we do have multiple layers of fixed effects that tries to tease out that at any macroeconomic factors or factors at the occupational industry level that can become confounding our household decision variables, labor supply, and human capital investment. But the bottom line is that we use two different models to test our hung shape. Or the first one is that we use a quadratic model, including the square term of leverage to capture this nonlinear shape, this hung shape. And we also use a separate model, as you see on the right side, which is called the linear piecewise model, which can help us detect how significant the switching in the shape is, in the hung shape is. So we will leave the details about these models to the paper, but the bottom line, the takeaway here is that we confirm from the regression the pattern that we saw from this baseline picture here. Okay? So now the next thing that we're going to do is to test this very important parameter that we just talked about in the model, that is the skills depreciation, right? So what is the prediction, again, from the model, is that if the skill has a high depreciation rate, that means that most of the value will be materialized very quickly as cash, as earnings, and that part of materialized earnings will be taken away by the creditors, and for that kind of skills, we expect them to be subject to more data round. Okay, so we're going to test that model prediction, and how are we going to capture the skills depreciation empirically? We're going to use two different approaches. The first approach is based on the existing literature, okay, that argues that skills exposed to technology and computer science is more likely to become obsolete in the future. Okay? In our data, we can observe what kind of skills are learned from each training program. So we can characterize to what extent this training, the skill is exposed to the computer technology. Okay? And a high exposure will be identified as high depreciation. Okay? So that's the first approach. And the second approach is based on our own model intuition. That is, we're going to look at the change, the path of the individual's wage changes surrounding the training. That is, we observe what the individual's wages are before and after the training completion. And then we can see if the individual's wage initially increases a lot after training, but then the increments decays very fast in the long term. And if that's the case, that's an indication of a higher depreciation rate for the skills. Okay? So here is the result. And we're going to separately look at the cases with skills with high versus low depreciation. And this picture is plotted based on the estimated coefficients from our regressions. Okay? So the left side is the high depreciation and the right side is the low depreciation. And we indeed see what our model predicts. That is, when the skills have high depreciation, on the left, we see both an earlier manifestation of debt outcome and a sharper manifestation of debt outcome. And in this case, this type of skills is behaving more like labor supply. The intuition is consistent with the model. Okay? And we can also do the same thing using our second approach to capture depreciation, but I will skip that because the results are almost identical. The shape is almost identical to the first approach. Okay? So in the last of the part of the paper, we have some alternatives. We consider some alternative theories, and then we do some robustness tests. For example, the existing empirical papers have proposed several alternative theories that might also generate this hung shape that we documented. And we look at those alternatives and we don't find any empirical support. And we also borrow this very nice instrument and variable approach from Bernstein 2021, which is the student finance paper. And then we're going to instrument our household average using that approach. And then we find robustness results for our empirical paper. Okay? So with that, let me conclude by saying that in this paper, we build a model to show that household average can differentially affect the two actions, labor supply and human capital investment, because of the inseparability of the human capital nature. Okay, and we use the survey data to test this model and find consistent results. So normally I will stop here, but because the conference program is so generous to present this time, and since I guess I still have maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and let me take advantage of that time to talk about briefly talk about a follow-up project that we are all very excited about. So this project expands its first paper, but focus on one specific type of housing debt, that is student loans. And the intuition is as follows. So as you probably recall that in this first paper, why do we have debt overhang problem to begin with? That is because of the anticipation of debt discharge in the bankruptcy. Knowing that my debt will be wiped out, I don't want to work anymore. However, that's not the case for student loans. Student loans are mostly non-dischargeable in the previous bankruptcy. Okay? If there's no dischargeability, there's no debt overhang. So as you can imagine, in this case, if the household has a larger proportion, has a larger representation of student loans among the household debt, then the household should be less subject to the debt overhang problem. And this is indeed what we find as the first result of that follow-up project. That is what we call the corrective effect of student loans, because it essentially corrects the distortion in households' incentives in supply and labor. Okay? But there are more nuances to that. It turns out that the student borrowers can choose several different plans, repayment plans, when paying down the student loans. And we show that one of those programs, one of those repayment plans, which is called IDR, the income-driven repayment plans, can actually reactivate the debt overhang problem. Okay? And the intuition is that the IDR program sets the payment as the proportion to the student's income, and that proportion is fixed, regardless how much the person has borrowed initially, and regardless how much the person has repaid at the time of entering IDR. So you can imagine, because of that fixed proportion, it's essentially pseudo-discharging the student's debt in exchange for a proportion of the student's future income. Okay? So in that case, the student loan becomes somewhat dischargeable again, and because of that dischargeability, the debt overhang problem re-emerges. So that's what we call the setback effect of the IDR. Okay? So in this paper, we analyze these two opposing effects, we calibrate the model, and then we use empirical data to look at which of the two opposing effects dominates. And based on that, we derive policy implications, and particularly we look at the Biden's student loan relief program in 2022, which promotes to make the access of IDR more easy to the student borrowers. And we show that this can actually have an unintended consequence for students' incentives to save on labor because of this setback effect. Okay? And we're all very excited about this paper, and we look for other opportunities to present it. Of course, I would be very happy to discuss this paper after the presentation. And thank you very much, and I look forward to the comments from the discussion.
So first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper and to read this paper in advance. I'm very excited reading it. Let me start by saying that it's not like my primary field of research, so I'm not that much of an expert in the field. So take the points that I make maybe as a remark on what the average reader might have as a comment, and take it that way. And so let's dive into the paper. To remind you, we're going to the first paper again, the paper on the debt overhang problem and investment in human capital. So I think the presentation gave us a very good idea of the paper, so I want to be short on wrapping up the paper again. So the idea is that as there's rising debt ratios in the US households, there is research on the impact on labor supply of US households. And this paper tries to study a new relationship, which is the relationship between household leverage and its impact on labor supply and human capital investment. The authors do this in two separate ways. First, they build a dynamic model trying to understand the impact of different levels of leverage on labor supply, but then also on human capital investments. But this model also includes savings and borrowing decisions to formulate the important hypothesis that we saw and that we're going to discuss a little now. And then in the second part of the paper, they use the specific data set called the National Longitudinal Survey to test the hypothesis, and they find that the predictions hold with the data. Okay, so I have first some remarks on the model, which are that the model, of course, posits a rational and forward-looking agent that rationally chooses consumption, savings, labor supply, and of course the level of training, right? As the household does so, it takes into account its future level of debt and the possibility of bankruptcy or debt overhang. And then the question for me, and I think the model, at least in the paper, is a little bit mute on that aspect, is what actually leads to increasing debt in the model. And here, me personally, I'm thinking about this model in a kind of life cycle dynamic aspect, right? So I'm looking at one individual that looks at his or her own life cycle and then understands in the future maybe there's going to be higher debt, and maybe this individual will come into this debt overhang problem and makes current decisions on labor supply but also human capital investment given that future outcomes. And then the question for me is how actually individuals in the model come to that high levels of debt, given that bankruptcy actually becomes probable, right? And maybe this is a very European view on things, but I would argue that the rising debt in the model to some degree is not that much internalized, so that I don't see that kind of like this utility of reaching very high debt levels, and I wonder if the model predictions would be very different if we would internalize that to some degree. So here my question is a little bit how agents come to high debt levels and how this is internalized in the model. So for me, my understanding at the moment is that the model variation in debt comes very much from a kind of a cross-section point of view, right? And not that much from a life cycle point of view of the agent in the model. And so this might be the answer to that, but to maybe make it more clear why I asked this question, let me come to the main picture of the model which is here the left side that we focus on, and we argued, or the authors argue, that skill acquisition across leverage of the household kind of has these two opposing forces. One is this marginal utility force that is more stronger in the first part, where as leverage increases to some degree, individuals understand that if they work more, if they put more investment into skill acquisition, this will give them an opportunity to pay back their debts easier because they have higher income and so on. At some point, these households understand that they're at the point of leverage where actually it's not worth anymore to invest too much into skill acquisition, because the debt overhang force, as you call it in the paper, kind of is strong, right? So it is very important in the model for the individual, for this mechanism to hold, that the individual understands at which point in this distribution they are, and to make a forward-looking skill acquisition decision, right? And this forward-looking skill acquisition decision has to incorporate some kind of individual expectations towards future leverage and individual expectation towards the evolution of individual leverage, right? And so this is, to my understanding, is crucial to the leverage, to the debt overhang force to become very important in the model, and therefore to formulate these hypotheses that you make. And this is why I think this major component of the model actually should incorporate, or this is why I think the point that I wanted to make in the first slide might be interesting or is important, because if the model is kind of mute on debt and how debt evolves over time, and if the model is kind of also mute a little bit on how individuals internalize the effect of future debt, then it might be, I don't know, I'm not so certain on how these hypotheses are formalized if we take this into account. Then two very small issues. The first is that you kind of set parameters in order to solve the model, and I'm not so sure on which role the parameters play, not the ones that you discuss. That is very nice, but also other important parameters are set in the model, and they of course drive this picture, right, to a large degree. So I was a little mute on that, but I guess that's good. I just wanted to ask. And then I wonder, like in the introduction, you make the point that this has very interesting policy implications. So I just wonder, you have a nice model. It has a certain amount of interesting ingredients. Why not use the model and make some policy simulations and try to understand how maybe different ways to formulate how bankruptcy works might affect the main hypothesis of results. Okay, so and then let me quickly come, as I see it, I'm running out of time, to the empirical testing results. So the first point I think doesn't matter so much, but I'm a little bit, so my understanding of the data set is not that strong, as I don't really know what the source of variation in leverage in the data is, right? So my understanding is it on the life cycle? So are there individuals that over their life cycle come to a higher amount of leverage, or is there a very high amount of individuals that never come to this point, whereas other points in the cross-section or in the other social groups, they come to this point over their life cycle? This might be interesting to understand the variation and then also understand the estimation. Also the last one I think is not that important. Yeah, so because I'm running out of time, there's a footnote 16 that you made in which you state yourself that it might be, of course, endogenous to some degree that along the income and therefore human capital distribution, there is a group of individuals who might be more indebted because they are more often unemployed, because they have lower income, but at the same time, this is the group of individuals who might have lower returns on investment, right? So obviously, there is a lot of indigeneity between these two aspects, human capital investment and leverage. At least that's my understanding here. And this is why I think it's rather important to understand that the variation in leverage in the model comes and the data comes from. So you make the claim that the results show that the life cycle dynamic or the life cycle aspect is not that important in explaining the variation, but I did not understand that to that degree, which is probably my problem. Just one note as the kind of the average reader of the paper. Okay, and as I'm running out of time, so thanks a lot again for giving me the opportunity. It's a very polished paper, very nice to read, has a very clear red thread to follow, which is extremely nice. Yeah, so thanks a lot.
First of all, let me say thank you very much for the insightful comments and for reading the paper carefully. And some of these comments were also heard similar ones from other, feedback, other occasions. So let me just quickly respond to probably one or two most important comments, and then I can take more questions from the audience. The first one is about the model, about the endogeneity, about endogenize the leverage decision of the households. We actually heard about this comment several times, and we thought a lot about this. And the reason why we didn't go that route is that we can endogenize the household's decision on the level of leverage and how much debt they want to take. But that will need a more sort of general equilibrium model, because then we need to consider the lender's lending capacity, and we need to consider whether the lenders will anticipate all these different actions from the households, whether this is more or less subject to the debt of compromise depending on the labor supply of human capital. So for tractability and for to keep the main message of the model clean, and we choose to abstract from that perspective. But you're absolutely right. So in a more general equilibrium model, we can consider how the household eventually reaches the level of the leverage that we are, and we can have a more general equilibrium model. But so far, when we thought about this problem, we feel that that route will not substantially change the key message of the model, which is human capital and labor supply are two different variables because of the inseparability feature. And the reason we think that our main takeaway will be robust to that further consideration in the general equilibrium model is that no matter what that, for example, the lender's decisions are, and how the market condition of the credit availability of the credit is, those conditions will not significantly impact that feature, that inseparability feature. That just comes as the nature of the human capital versus labor supply versus the earnings. But that's our take, and of course I will pass this message to my co-authors, and we will think more about whether we should formally put an extension of the model in the paper, or we should at least acknowledge this or discuss this in the paper. And the second one is about the empirical comment on where the variation in leverage is. So what we do see that the variation comes in both the time series, fixing one individual, as well as cross-sectional. And in the next version, we can certainly tabulate more characteristics about, the source of these variations. And one thing that I would like to note, which is actually very important, or you can think of this as a limitation of our study, is that we look at the trainings that are offered once the individuals start their career. Okay, so usually those training programs, the take-up of the trainings is sort of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, meaning that the individuals will not take the training programs every 2 or 3 years. They will probably just do it once or at least twice in their whole career life. So for that reason, we cannot sort of tease out which variation is driving our results by including individual fixed effect, and compare that specification with the ones without the individual fixed effect. Because in that, once we put in that individual fixed effect, even though our X variable leverage still has variation, our Y variable training will lose the variation. So that is an important point, design that we need to keep in mind, or sort of a limitation for our empirical study. But I do agree with you that in the next version, at least in the summary statistics, we can pan out more clearly, how much of the variation comes from time series given individual, and how much comes from the cross section. Yeah. Thank you again for those comments. Yes?
I have a question about the institutional setting. So once a household declares bankruptcy, what happens? Like, is it just like at this point in time, essentially the debt is cleared and they move on, or how long does it?
So I can speak to the U.S. bankruptcy. So there are two options for the household to file bankruptcy. One is to file Chapter 7, one is to file Chapter 13. So Chapter 7 is the largely used approach, and there was a study showing that over 87% of households file Chapter 7. And once you file Chapter 7, most of the debts that are eligible for discharge will be discharged. And based on that same study, 99% of the debt in Chapter 7 is eventually discharged. Okay, so that's the first method. And the second approach is to file Chapter 13. And it is different from Chapter 7 in the sense that the individual cannot discharge the debt, but instead they have to make plans for future repayments. And in that case, they can keep their assets, right? So when you discharge the debt, you have to give up most of the assets in order to recoup some of the losses for the creditors. But that's for Chapter 7. But for Chapter 13, you get to keep the assets, but they have to make plans to make future payments. And about 13 to 15% of the U.S. households use that Chapter 13. Yeah, so the Chapter 7 here is what we focus on, and that is, where we, that is the basis for us to claim that, there's a discharge of the person's debt, and that induces the house.
Would you also look at the Chapter 13 and see if that impacts people's investment in human capital?
So in that case, we have a model of that yet, and we haven't done any empirical analysis because empirically we cannot observe what chapter the person files. But intuitively, from a model theoretical perspective, we feel in that case the results will get somewhat muted because first of all, there's no debt discharge. That means that there's no debt overhang to begin with. And if there's no debt overhang to begin with, then the differences between these two actions, which lies in the differences in how the debt overhang problem shows up, more or less aggressively, will become more muted. Okay, so to some extent, I think that question is partially answered by our second project that we talked at the end, in which case there's no debt overhang. But that's not coming from Chapter 13. That's coming from a different type of house of debt that student wants. But thank you. Yes.
So one area you've been exploring here is the role of time. So you're going to invest in human capital, and then depending on when you default, the other party either does or doesn't get the benefit. But what I want to highlight too is that there's an important element of risk in the human capital that I think you want to think about exploiting. Imagine that you're thinking about a nursing certificate, which I'm going to call safe. You know it's going to pay off. If you're extremely debt laden, you know you're going to default anyways. Any additional proceeds from that are going to accrue to your debtor. But if you're not that indebted, proceeds from that would accrue to you. So it's relatively more appealing when you're less indebted. But now imagine an entrepreneurship certificate, which I'm making up as something risky. Now you're very indebted, you're planning on defaulting, but the entrepreneurship certificate gives you a coin flip that gives you the ability to get out of trouble and you get the upside. But if you have less debt, taking on this gamble just gives you a chance to get yourself into trouble. So what I want to say is that this idea of more and less indebted interacting with human capital has a really nice cross-sectional testable implication around the riskiness of the type of human capital you choose, and you might think about exploiting that in your empirical.
Yes, that's a very good point. So I can partially answer that question by pointing to that in our model, we do have this parameter, which is sigma in the model, which captures the income uncertainty, which in turn captures the sort of the risk of accumulating human capital. But so we do have, I didn't have time to show this, but we do have a comparative statics analysis in the paper that changes the level of the risk, the income uncertainty. And what we find is that, I think it's consistent with the intuition, is that, well, maybe not, but we find is that as the as the acidity goes higher, people tend to accumulate more human capital actually. And the intuition is that sort of a standard precautionary, action theory is that if I know that my income will become more volatile in the future because this is a risk-averse household, that decreases my utility. And to combat that part of the loss in my utility, I want to work a little bit harder. So that's what's generating the higher level overall for human capital investment. But I think what you're suggesting is a little bit more nuanced than that. Is that we can probably introduce a different parameter for labor supply versus human capital, and we can see that. We can see that when this differentiation on these two sides of the actions can affect the decisions set.
So, and I would do it in the empirics first, because if you don't find anything, there's no point in putting the model. But
Okay.
if it works in your empirical exercise, you could imagine building a model where you choose the sigma,
Yeah.
and then you can.
Yeah, that's right. We do. Yes, empirically we do observe the volatility of the person's wage, and we can differentiate. Yes, we can differentiate versus low, and we can possibly separate that out for labor supply. Yes. Yes.
So, we refer a lot to the that overhang problem here. I do understand that overhang is a problem in firms, where the firm no longer wants to invest in projects that will actually yield return, because that's going to go to the debtors. Here, I would say, sure, whenever I use my labor, whatever proceeds I get from it are going to go to my debtors, and then I'm going to supply less labor. However, as an individual, is our goal to supply as much hours of labor as we want, or is it to live well? Right, and so what is really the problem of not supplying as many hours of labor? What are the implications for earnings? What are the implications for being compensated to actually going to acquire skills, for example? Right? How can you speak to this?
Yes. So this is a very important question, and we thought about this before. But let me answer that and see if that fits your question, based on my understanding. Is that what you're saying is that there is a difference between the setting of corporate finance and household finance, and we think that this difference is actually driving some uniqueness, some unique feature of our model in the following sense. In a corporate finance, once the firm files bankruptcy, the firm is essentially dead, meaning that the shareholders cannot, get anything out of the current firm anymore. But as a household, as an individual, after we file bankruptcy, we continue to live our lives for the, for the rest of the time. So what that means is that there's a difference, that continuation of living generates the difference between human capital and labor supply. Because if I acquire labor supply, if I provide labor supply, if I earn earnings, that earning would be taken away during default, and that's it. But if I invest in human capital, I can continue to use that human capital because I will continue to live after I default. Okay, so that situation is not going to happen for corporate finance, because the corporate finance, they also have human capital. You can also say they have soft capital. But once the firm files bankruptcy, the current shareholders cannot continue to live, continue to use the human capital unless the existing human shareholders grab all the human capital and start a new firm identical to the original one, so they can continue to use some of the accumulated, like loan officers or suppliers in this future. Okay, so that's an extension of the standard corporate finance model. We have to assume that shareholders can grab everything and start a new firm using the same set of capital. So that is why we think that our model is interesting and it is unique from the corporate finance model, which only considers the case where the firm ceases to exist after the default, but we can extend that to what happens after the default. And that's only true for the household setting, but not the corporate setting.
Yeah, it was more related to your implications on the IDR, income driven repayment for student loans.
Yeah.
You say, you know, these reinstates the debt overhang problem, and then people don't want to supply as much labor. I was thinking, it's actually cool, right? I don't need to supply as much labor. I don't need to kill myself working 3 jobs to pay my student loan. I can only work one and rest.
That's
and
exactly.
live prosperously.
That's exactly our argument, because in the IDR case, the incentive distortion comes from 2 sources. One is ex ante, one is exposed. The ex ante one is that I know that my debt now can be pseudo discharged for the intuition that I just said. Ex ante, I don't want to work. Okay? Exposed, I don't want to work either. Why? Because now I have to give up a proportion. So currently it is 15% of my income as the IDR payment. Why do I want to do that? Because that 15% is essentially the heightened taxes for me, right? So now I'm paying a high taxes. I don't want to work that much anymore. I just, instead of working as a nurse, I work as a janitor, because as the janitor, I earn, $10,000 a year, and so my payment is low. My payment to the student loan is just 15% of my income regardless. So I want to enjoy life instead of working. So you're absolutely right. So the IDR reactivates the debt overhang ex ante and further distorts people's incentive exposure. So that's what we find, and that's why we say that there's an unintended consequence for promoting this IDR from the private administration. Yes.
So this was interesting. I was wondering if you have data to look at the labor supply of partners. Say, there are other margins of this, like say retirement would be one. You can check for the people who actually are high debt, they can retire the debt. Also, your spouse, your partner could have the similar behavior, or maybe offsetting behavior, like saving more or applying more labor, or maybe because that is it's a household level value, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So
this would, maybe corroborate your story, or if you have data for this, or fertility even could be an household variable to look at.
So that's an interesting point from both the theoretical perspective and empirical perspective. From the theoretical perspective, it is essentially saying that whether there's sort of a spillover effect that the household debt is affecting apparently the entire family, not just the head of the family, but also the spouse.
Household model.
Yeah. So
with the unitary collective,
yeah. So that's very interesting theory. So empirically, I don't think that we can observe. Yeah, because the survey only, my understanding, I have to double check on this. The survey only asks for the head of the household. So they don't ask.
At least you can distinguish singles and couples.
Yeah. So maybe we can do that. A married versus single, something like that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Real quick. So there's a lot of state level variation in the strength of bankruptcy laws that you can also exploit.
Yes.
So Neil Mahoney has this great bankruptcy as implicit health insurance paper. It's like his job market paper. He spent a lot of time going and gathering all these state laws, and then published it in 8 hours, so it's public. You can just go download that data set.
Okay.
Be another interesting.
So your prediction would be if the strength of the bankruptcy law is strong, then that will make
the hump shape more pronounced, right?
because the debt will be more likely to be discharged or less likely to be discharged.
So bankruptcy is more strong, it would be less likely to discharge. So I guess, more lenient bankruptcy.
More lenient. I see. When you say strong, you didn't mean like the enforcement of the bankruptcy.
Yeah,
you mean like the leniency.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Just quickly. So in your model, right, everyone defaults probability 1, just not certain exactly when. Exactly.
Yes, that's correct.
So I think, the discussing touched upon this a bit too, but I think that that's a very strong assumption, and then it makes me think that the mechanism you're describing is not so much about overhang itself, but more about these are people who they're not just anticipating that they might default, but they're planning on defaulting. And because they're planning on defaulting, that's gonna affect their behavior over the entire, the entire analysis period in your model. So that's gonna be, that's gonna have different implications than, like someone else was saying, you might choose to change your labor supply because perhaps in some states of the world you're going to default, and then there are other implications. But in your model, you default probability 1, and then you also lose access to credit markets for the rest of your life. So you become, hand-to-mouth household because your ST equals 0 for the rest of your life, and then when that happens, then you have no way to insure yourself against any shocks, and then any kind of changes are going to be very important for welfare. So that's just something to think about, in your model, maybe you want to have some people that don't default at all, that there's a probability of defaulting, but not necessarily defaulting with probability 1. And then one just very quick thing, possibly. On the other paper mentioned, super interesting, we'll talk more about lunch because I have some work on kind of the choice between IDR. One thing with IDR though is that, the standard plan is 10 years and it's a fixed payment, it's amortized, and then the IDRP payment, that's capped at the SRP, and then after 25 years, the outstanding debt is forgiven. But then the trade-off there is that over the life of the loan, the individuals who opt into it, two things. Number one is they're going to make more payments over the life of the loan, right? They're going to, in total, have made much larger payments for 25 years, but there's a trade-off that, they're making smaller payments for longer, and most people might be willing to do that. But the other thing is that when you actually go to get a mortgage or other kind of loan, not only does your monthly payment matter, but also the stock of debt matters, right? The bank will not want to give you another loan. You're saying, I'm making a $10 a month student loan payment, and every month, and you're negatively amortizing, it's growing, and a lot of these loans are negatively amortized. So there is also, it's not exactly a free lunch, right? Because there is a cost that the balance loan is growing, and then you have this, relative to this paper, the debt overhang story, I'm making small payments, but I owe someone else $1 million, and sure, that'll be forgiven in 25 years. But the bank won't necessarily want to give you a loan today. So that's another angle where I think it might attenuate some of the effects you discussed for the other paper that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I think the last point about how banks will treat the current student loans, and especially when the interest rate is capitalized to the principal, I think that is a very interesting point. And in our second project, we currently don't consider that. And again, the second project has a very similar style as the first project in the sense that it's not a general equity model, in the sense that we don't explicitly model the bank's lending decision incorporating everything, and we sort of take the leverage as given and see how that affects people's decisions. But for the first point where the IDR will be forgiven, and where the interest rate will keep accumulating, and capitalized to the principal, and we do have that in our model for the second.
I mean, what I would say for that, and you can use this how I use it, is that at least for the supply of student debt, you don't need to worry about GE because more than 95% of it is supplied by the federal government, and there's no pricing for person. Congress sets the rate. It's a very political process, and then that's the rate for everybody. I mean, for other forms of debt, sure, but at least for the supply of student debt, you don't need to worry about GE.
Just to keep on time, we'll.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.